Hello, everybody. Welcome to your next episode of the Average American Podcast. I am your host, Sergey. In this episode, we will talk about the science, technology, and history of firearms. Personally, I still remember the first time I held a Glock 19 at a shooting range. I was both excited and nervous, feeling the texture grip in my hand and the weight of the semi-automatic pistol. I lined up the sights on the target, took a deep breath, and squeezed the trigger. Bang! The 9mm round punched a neat hole in the paper. That day wasn't just about the Glock, but about my developing appreciation for firearms. Later, I also got to fire a modest 410 shotgun and a Plinker Ruger 1022 rifle, a popular 22 caliber rifle. I got both because I wanted to get a different experience with different firearms. Each one of them felt different to me. The pistols, more or less sharp recoil, the shotgun satisfying thump against the shoulder, and 22 rifles light pop and easy accuracy. I decided to get my first firearm in 2022 after reading about a number of anti-Semitic protests and violence against Jews. I was interested in firearms ever since I learned to shoot a rifle at a high school in Ukraine in the early 80s, which was a mandatory skill for all high schoolers. I went to the shooting range down the street in 2022 that I noticed many years ago. The folks at Main Street Guns and Range were extremely nice and helpful. They recommended a safety course, which I took one Saturday, and tried shooting a 22 pistol as part of that course. I purchased my Glock the next week. I picked the brand because it was so easy to clean mainly, and it had very high reliability reports. First time I shot my Glock and hit the target in more or less center, I felt a sense of accomplishment that I successfully acquired a new skill in life. Those early target hits sparked my curiosity. I found myself not only enjoying the challenge of marksmanship, but also wondering how these firearms worked and where did they come historically. That personal journey, from handling modern guns to questioning their mechanism and history, is what brings us to today's episode. I'll be your host, taking you through a blend of personal stories and insights into firearms. We'll explore how guns evolved from smoky black powder muskets to the high-tech rifles of today. We'll break down how firearms actually work, from old flintlock ignition to modern firing systems, and we'll demystify some of the ballistic jargon along the way. By the end, we'll also touch on how firearms fit into American society, from sport and hunting to military and debates about regulation, hopefully in a neutral, natural, and informative tone. So whether you're a seasoned enthusiast or just curious or a novice, let's embark on this journey through the science, technology, and history of guns and rifles. Firearms as a technology have a truly global history spanning over 1,000 years. Historians generally point to China's ancient fire lance as the first gun. The fire lance was essentially a spear with a tube of gunpowder that shot out flame and shrapnel, a far cry from a modern rifle, but it set the stage for everything to come. By the 14th century or so, crude hand cannons and tubular guns had spread across Asia and in Europe. The early European record shows firearms in use by mid-14th century. By end of 14th century, handheld guns were known across the entire Europe. These medieval firearms were matchlock designs, meaning they relied on a burning match cord to ignite the powder. Firing one was awkward. You had to touch a lit wick to the touch hole in the barrel to set off the charge, often using one hand for the wick and the other one to aim. Not exactly a rapid fire technology, not to talk about the multi-minute effort to reload the gun. Around 1400s, gunsmiths developed the first actual firing mechanism, known as matchlock. In a matchlock musket, a lever, called a trigger, lowers a smoldering match cord into a small pan of black powder, the flash pan, which then ignites the main charge in the barrel. That allows soldiers to keep both hands on the gun while firing. A big aiming improvement. Matchlock were used in Europe by colonial militias, and they had obvious drawbacks as guns. The glow match could give away your position at night and was very useless in the rain or in wet conditions in general. Still, for a couple of centuries, the matchlock kind of remained your basic standard, state-of-the-art musket. A close-up of an early flintlock musket's firing mechanism, the frizzen, or the steel plate, and pan were visible. In a flintlock, when trigger is pulled, the hammer holding flint strikes the steel frizzen to create sparks. And that was a big improvement from the previous lit wick kind of a design. By the early 1600s, a major innovation arrived to firearms, the flintlock ignition system. In a flintlock firearm, the lock mechanism used to place the flint held in a spring-loaded hammer. When you pull the trigger, the flint strikes a steel plate called the frizzen that covers the flash pan. The impact does two things at once. It opens the pan cover and showers sparks into the priming powder in the pan. Those sparks ignite the powder, flame shoots through a small touch hole in the main charge, and boom, the gun fires. This clever design meant you no longer needed a lit wick. The spark was generated on demand by the weapon itself. Flintlocks were so successful and reliable that they dominated firearms for 200 years. In fact, from 1600 to 19th century, nearly all the guns, from muskets to pistols, were flintlocks. The classic Brown Bess musket that armed the British troops and many American revolutionaries was a flintlock, and it saw service for decades. Of course, flintlocks had their own quirks. Flint edges dulled with use and needed knapping or replacing, and there were often a noticeable delay between the trigger pull and the gun firing, as the powder fizzed in the pan for a few seconds, or maybe a little less. Even so, for its time, flintlock was a game changer in terms of reliability. The next leap in the ignition came in early 1800s. In 1807, Reverend Alexander Forsyth invented a rudimentary percussion cap system. By 1820s, the idea was refined into a cap lock mechanism. A small metal cap filled with shock-sensitive explosive was placed in the nipple at the breech. When struck by a falling hammer, the cap detonated and sent flame into the barrel to ignite the main charge. Percussion caps were more weatherproof and reliable than flint. No exposed powder to get dim. By around 1830s or so, percussion cap guns were in general use, and armies worldwide began converting old flintlock muskets to percussion or adopting new caps lock rifles. If you have seen Western movies with the old revolvers, those were often cap and ball revolvers, each chamber loaded with powder and a bullet and a percussion cap at the back. Speaking of revolvers, Samuel Colt's, I'm sure you recognize name Colt, first revolver came out in 1835, bringing multi-shot capacity and capability to handguns. Colt's use of precision machining enabled interchangeable parts and mass production, making revolvers both affordable and widely popular. As 19th century moved forward, we'll see the rise of breech-loading firearms and self-contained cartridges that combine both the main charge and the bullet and the firing surcharge. Early experiments like the pinfire cartridge and the rimfire ammo, first full rimfire cartridge was produced in 1859, allowed faster reloading. In a single combustible package, cartridge combined bullet, powder, and the primer charge. The American Civil War saw both muzzle-loading muskets and new breech-loading rifles in action. Notably, the Spencer repeating carbine, patented in 1860, was a 7-shot lever-action rifle using cartridge, giving Union troops a formidable advantage in firepower. By 1861, breech loaders were common, and by the late 1860s, 1870s, the transition from loose powder and ball to cartridges was for the most part complete. Along with the cartridges came mechanism to fire multiple shots without a reloading each time. Lever-action rifles like the famous Winchester 1873 could fit a new round with a flick of a lever, letting the shooter fire successive shots from a magazine tube. The Winchester became so iconic in America that it was called the gun that won the West. Bolt-action rifles also emerged in the 19th century. The bolt handle on the side is lifted and pulled back to eject one round, you spent round, and to put back in place a new chamber round. By the 1880s and 1890s, most armies adopted bolt-action magazine-fed rifle, reliable, accurate, and fast-firing by those standards. Handguns were not static either. By 1892, inventors like Joseph Lohman has produced the first semi-automatic pistol where the energy of one shot could automatically load the next shot. The Lohman and the Borchardt C93 from 1893 were among the earliest automatic pistols. Soon followed the design by Mauser, Luger, and Browning. The age of modern firearms truly began in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Let's look at the last 100 years. The 20th century saw an explosion of firearm innovations. An unfortunate pun intended. Early in the century, we got first successful semi-automatic rifles, like 1903 Winchester. Later, we saw M1 Garand used in World War II by American troops. The first assault rifle appeared around World War II as well. It was the German STG-44, which used intermediate cartridges and selective fire, where you could do single shot or full auto, meaning that if you hold the trigger, the gun keeps firing as long as the rounds in the magazine. After World War II, designs like AK-47, judging by the model number, it was first produced in 1947, and later American AR-15, roughly in 1950s, first adopted by military as the new model M16, which I'm sure you've heard. They set the template for modern military rifles. Intermediate kind of caliber, detachable magazine, capable of both semi-automatic and burst fire. In parallel, civilian sporting firearms advanced too, capable of both semi-automatic or burst fire. Modern hunting rifles refined the bolt action. Shotgun got pump action and semi-auto variants. The handgun saw the revolver eclipsed in many ways by semi-automatic pistol. We'll talk about those polymers used in modern firearm bodies and other tech in a moment. To recap the big picture, from black powder matchlocks to polymer pistols, firearms technology evolved over the last millennia by increasing reliability, rate of fire accuracy, and ease of use. It's a fascinating progression, and each step was driven by the inventive quest for a faster, safer, and more effective firearm. Let's do a quick little recap of big parts of firearms. So first was ignition system. We talked about matchlock, flintlock, percussion cap, and then cartridge primers. And as far as loading mechanism, we went through single shot, then various repeaters, revolver, bolt action rifle, lever action rifle, pump action rifle, and a shotgun. And then we talk about semi-automatic and fully automatic shotguns. Now let's talk about ballistics, or how bullets actually fly. Shooting as much is about physics as it is about mechanics. The study of ballistics is essentially the science of projectiles or bullets in motion, and it's often broken into internal ballistics, what happens inside the gun, external ballistics, how the bullet flies when it leaves the gun, and terminal ballistics, what happens when a bullet fits the target. We won't be doing the actual calculus, but let's cover a few key ballistic concepts to explain the technology. First off, you have muzzle velocity. This is the speed at which projectile travels the moment it leaves the gun's barrel. Typically, it's given in feet per second or meters per second. Higher muzzle velocity generally means a flatter trajectory, meaning a little less drop as the bullet flies, and more energy delivered to the target. Then we have a caliber, which is the diameter of the firearms bore, and by extension the diameter of the bullet. It can be expressed in inches, either decimals or fractions or millimeters, or other numbers. For example, .50 caliber barrel means a half inch across. 9mm barrel means 9mm across. Caliber tells you the size of the bullet, but not necessarily its length or power. Small caliber like .22 or 5.6 millimeters are for light bullets, while something like .308 or 7.62 millimeters is the full power rifle caliber. The name of calibers can be kind of quirky. You have .38 Special, .357 Magnum, which essentially use the same diameter despite the names. But in general, caliber gives you a quick sense of the firearm's bore size. In summary, it's basically the internal diameter of the barrel or external diameter of the projectile. Sometimes we talk about grains for bullet weight. Bullet weights are often stated in those numbers called grains or abbreviated to GR. And that confuses a lot of newcomers because it's not grams, which also sometimes abbreviated to GR. A grain is a very small unit of weight. 1 grain, which is a standard weight, is 1/7,000th of a pound, or roughly about 0.065 grams. So a 147 grain 9mm bullet weighs 147 over 7,000 of a pound, or roughly about 9.5 grams. Why these grains came about? It's just a historical unit that for some reason stuck in the ammo world. The next small concept is muzzle energy. It's the kinetic energy of the bullet as it leaves the muzzle, usually in foot-pounds or joules. Muzzle energy is the function of bullet weight and velocity. Heavier, faster bullets will deliver more energy to the target. Then we talk about bullet drop. Bullets don't fly in a straight line because gravity starts pulling them down as soon as they leave the barrel. Bullet drop refers to how far the bullet falls over a given distance. It's typically measured as the vertical drop below the line of the bore. For example, if you zero a rifle at 100 yards, by 300 yards the bullet might drop many inches, requiring you essentially to just aim higher, accounting for gravity. In physical terms, the bullet path is a parabolic trajectory. Gravity accelerates it downward and creates a curve. Bullet drop is more pronounced with slower projectile. A .22 LR or long rifle fired from a rifle might drop several inches by 100 yards, whereas high velocity .308 might only drop a couple of inches at 200 yards. Shooters must compensate by the drop by sighting in a range using scopes with elevation adjustments. In short, projectile drop is the vertical distance a bullet falls below the borderline during the flight, and understanding is crucial for long-range accuracy. Now let's talk about drag and ballistic coefficient. As a bullet flies through the air, it encounters actual air resistance, or drag, or friction. Drag slows the bullet down and also affects stability. The concept of ballistic coefficient comes into play here. It's a number that represents how well a bullet resists the drag. A higher BC, or ballistic coefficient, means a more aerodynamic bullet that retains velocity better, as a result has a flatter trajectory. Shape and weight distribution affects ballistic coefficient. For example, a sleek boat tail rifle bullet might have a BC of 0.5 or 0.6 for a 30 caliber match bullet, whereas a round nose pistol bullet might have a low BC of 0.1. Without diving too deep, drag will cause the bullet to slow down and eventually drop completely. If you ever heard the term bullet drop at some number of yards, drag is the big reason, and along with the gravity, why we see increasingly steep drop at longer ranges. The wind, as surprisingly as it is another factor. A bullet can drift sideways due to crosswind. And finally, we talk about more of a scary subject, but it is inescapable if we talk about firearms, and that's terminal ballistics. Though not listed explicitly, it's worth a brief mention. This is what happens on impact. It involves how bullet transfer energy to the target, how it expands or fragments in case of hollow point bullets, for example, and also how it penetrates the target. It's the part of the ballistic that matters for both hunting and self-defense, like for police, ensuring that the bullet is effective when you're defending your life or a life of people you love. For most casual target shooters like me, the critical external ballistic concept is just a foreign concept. If you zeroed at 50 yards, you'll need to aim simply higher to account for ballistic drop. An indoor pistol range, which is where I go, roughly, from our range goes to about 50 feet or so. You don't really need to worry about drop at all. You only need to worry about that at long rifle distances, hundreds of yards. Then you have to aim a little bit higher to compensate for the drop. We already talked about some innovations in guns. Now let's talk a few more. The next one would be rifling or spiraled barrels. That's one of the most important innovations for accuracy and distance. Rifling means cutting helical grooves inside the barrel that would give bullet a spin as it travels down the bore. The spin stabilizes the bullet gyroscopically, preventing it from tumbling in flight or just kind of varying how it travels, left, right, or top, bottom. Rifling was actually first experimented centuries ago with the first known sighting of 15th century, but it didn't become common military practice until 1800s, when minie ball, a conical expanding bullet, made muzzle-loaded rifle practical to load quickly. A spinning bullet is far more accurate than the spherical musket ball flung from a smoothbore. The difference was so dramatic. During the American Civil War, rifle musket could reliably hit targets at a few hundred yards, distances at which smoothbore muskets were largely useless or very unimpressive. Today, essentially every firearm, except shotguns shooting shot, used rifle barrels. And it's not about even pistols, even tank guns, because spin stabilization is crucial for accuracy and distance. If you look down the barrel, of course, quadruple check, it's not loaded, you will see those grooves. Maybe you need to shine like a little flashlight. That's the legacy of rifling. It turned hit or miss muskets into high precision instruments. A little aside, there is a modern so-called polygon rifle used by Glock and others. A slightly different take on the concept, using smoother, less sharply refined hills and valleys. But the idea is the same, is to give a bullet or projectile a spin. Next innovation was a smokeless powder. For centuries, black powder or gunpowder was the propellant in the firearms. It worked, but it had issues. It produced a huge cloud of smoke with every shot. It was corrosive and left heavy fouling in the barrel, and its energy was sort of limited. In the late 1800s, early 1900s came the invention of smokeless powder propellants, first by French chemist Paul Vieille in 1884. Smokeless powder was usually nitrocellulose based, single base or double base with nitroglycerin. The advantages were huge. It burned much cleaner, no huge clouds of smoke to impact your vision after you shoot. It produced higher energy, meaning higher velocity at longer distances, and as a result also smaller cartridges. And it fouled guns a lot less, which means you have to clean a little less, and they lasted longer. By 1890s, armies worldwide were switching to smokeless powder. This one innovation basically ushers what we know as modern firearms. For example, the famous 30-30 Winchester cartridge, invented in 1895, was one of the early smokeless sporting rounds. With smokeless powder, firearms could also be lighter because you didn't need thicker barrels, and could fire more rounds before they needed to be cleaned. It's not an exaggeration to say that smokeless powder revolutionized firearms much like microprocessor did for computers. Suddenly, performance leapt forward and new capabilities opened up. We already talked a little bit about high-capacity magazines. That was the next big invention, allow you to fire many rounds without having to reload. We also talked about semi-automatic and fully automatic actions, served essentially the same purpose. Then firearm materials have changed, and we sort of mentioned polymers, but let's talk about a little bit more about steel alloys that moved to polymers. Early firearms were made of wood for stocks and simple steel or iron for barrels. Over time, better steel alloys allowed for stronger but yet lighter barrels, and action could handle higher pressure cartridges more safely. In the late 20th century, we saw a move to polymer frames and polymer parts. A landmark was Gaston Glock. Gaston was the guy's first name. Designed in 1982, where Glock 17 pistol featured a mostly polymer frame with a steel slide and a steel barrel. This made the gun much lighter, at the same time more resistant to corrosion. Glock's success made polymer construction mainstream. Today, many guns, and even some rifle components, use high-strength polymer. Interestingly, first polymer frame handgun was actually H&K or Heckler & Koch VP70 in 1970, which was way ahead of its time with all plastic frame and 18-round capacity. It didn't become popular, but it sort of paved the way. Glock refined the concept, and by 1990, police and military forces around the world began adopting the tough, lightweight pistols in droves. Polymer isn't just for frames either. Modern firearms accessories like grips, stocks, and rails often use polymers or other composites to save weight. We'll also see aircraft-grade aluminum used in some receivers, such as AR-15 receiver halves, to cut the weight without sacrificing the strength. Let's also briefly mention aiming. Those big concepts are optics and also plain sights. Traditional iron sights, which are notches in the top of the gun, have existed for almost as long as guns. But the idea of using optics goes back to at least 17th or 18th centuries, when inventors toyed with putting a small telescopes on top of rifles. The first practical telescopic rifle sight was created around 1840s, according to the articles I read. By the Civil War, some sharpshooters had crude scopes. Fast forward today, we see a vast array of sighting technology. We have magnification scopes with optics for long range. We have red dot sights for a quick target acquisition, which essentially have like a small beam of light. And then we have some holographic even sights, laser sights, and even digital smart scopes without optics that can calculate ballistics on the fly and automatically adjust your aim. Optics arguably made the average shooter, like me, much more effective. For example, many hunters now confidently take game at ranges that would be challenging with iron sights. A red dot sight, well, I don't use red dot, I use a scope, 940 scope. On my Ruger 22, I can shoot a target at 50 feet, and sometimes I can make 20 straight shots, and I hit 3-inch round target with every single shot. So you can see I'm not a sharpshooter, and I do hold 1022 Ruger in my hands. I don't lean on the counter. And yes, me with just maybe a year of practice, I could do that. So that tells you how effective the sights are. Each of these innovations, rifle barrel, smokeless powder, repeaters, semi-auto, full auto, advanced materials and optics, they built upon previous inventions. More importantly, none of these made previous guns completely obsolete overnight, so people could adjust. There were transitional periods as a result. Soldiers and police carried loading rifle muskets that breech loaded, but ultimately the advantages of technology won out. As a firearm enthusiast, I find it fascinating to handle historical guns and feel the difference, but I would never personally buy one. Shooting a black powder muzzle loader connects you to the smoky Civil War era, and more, in my mind, it's more of a nostalgia than a practical. Finally, I left the hardest topic to discuss for last, which is how do firearms fit in society, their uses and debates around them. Firearms don't exist in a vacuum of just mechanics and physics and technology that we talked about. They've always had a profound connection with humans. People use firearms for various purposes, and over time, guns have become very firmly embedded in American culture, sport, law, and politics. Let's talk about a little bit briefly in a neutral tone, hopefully, about major context for use of firearms. First of all, sporting and competition. Many firearms are used in purely sporting contexts. These ranges from hunting, which has been a primary use for rifles and shotguns for centuries, or target shooting and competition. For example, there are Olympic shooting sports like 10mm air pistol, 50mm rifle 3-position, skid and trap shotgun events, where competitors demonstrate incredible precision. On a more casual level, there is plinking or informal target shooting, which is my primary activity. Competitive shooting can be quite specialized. Some of this competition also drives innovation. For instance, competition shooters help popularize things like red dot sights on pistols and improved ergonomics on rifles. Now let's talk about hunting and wildlife management. Firearms have long been tools for hunting game for actual food and population control of certain animals, as well as, interestingly enough, conservation efforts. Different guns suit different game. A duck hunter might use a 12 gauge shotgun loaded with birdshot or small projectiles, a number of them. A deer hunter could use a 30-06 or a similar rifle. For small game like rabbits or squirrels, 22 LR is common. Ethical hunting practices and regulations ensure that hunters aim for quick, if you could use the term humane kills, and follow seasons and limits to help manage wildlife populations to the point where they don't negatively impact human populations. In many rural communities, hunting isn't just for sport, but part of the lifestyle that evolved for centuries, and actually is still an important food source in some communities, not just in America, but around the world. Firearms in this context are seen as utilitarian tools, often passed down in families with a sense of heritage. Then we're talking about self-defense and home defense. Another facet is the use of firearms for personal protection. And that is the reason why I bought a Glock, to be honest. You can call me a paranoid, but to me, it seemed like a logical choice. Many people chose to own a handgun or a shotgun for home defense, feeling that it provides a means of protect themselves and loved ones in extreme situations, which unfortunately, although rarely, still do occur. In some countries and localities, carrying a concealed handgun for self-defense is legal and even practiced, sometimes even without a permit. The effectiveness of firearms as deterrents or defensive tools is a topic of much studied debate. But it's undeniable that for many individuals, owning a gun for defense offers a sense of security. On the flip side, it raises important responsibility. Training, secure storage, and understanding of the law. There are also non-lethal alternatives and many layers of personal safety strategy beyond firearms. So while firearms can be part of self-defense plan, they come with weighty consideration as when and how to use them in real-life encounters. I will inject my own personal story here. I already talked about why I bought firearms. I already talked that I took time to sit through a 6-hour course from a professional that explained how important safety considerations are and what responsibility I have as a firearm owner. As a result, I practice at least once a month, sometimes more often, to make sure I'm good at it, essentially. I bought a safe, and I actually waited for kids to be out of the house as well. A different set of paranoia. My gun is always in a safe. I actually have 2 safes, both the firearm and the projectiles are in the safe, and I keep my Glock near where I sleep, actually in my bedroom, where I have a small safe within an easy reach. So really, I feel like I'm pretty responsible firearm owner. Then we have to talk about military and law enforcement or police. From muskets to modern assault rifle, firearms have been central to warfare and policing. On the military side, entire doctrines and historical outcomes have been shaped by who had the better rifles or machine guns. For instance, the introduction of repeated rifles and later machine guns dramatically changed the tactics. Today's infantry carries rifles that are marvels of technology, often with modular attachments such as scope, night vision, or suppressors. Law enforcement uses firearms in the line of duty, typically handguns for officers and possibly shotguns or rifles for vehicles. Police firearms training focuses on precision as well as judgment, since they operate in civilian environments where identifying threats and avoiding bystanders is critical. The presence of firearms in criminal hands is one reason why law enforcement must be armed and trained. This aspect of firearms is perhaps the most somber. Guns can save lives in defense, but they can also be misused to cause harm. Society entrusts the military and police with firearms as means of protection, and that trust comes with intense training and rules of engagement. Finally, regulation and debate. Firearms ownership and use is a subject to law and personal debates in the United States. Different countries even have vastly different laws, from very strict control, permitting and very limited ownership, to more permissive environments like the one that exists in the United States. The debates around regulation often center on how to prevent misuse and violence while respecting lawful use and cultural traditions. There are discussions on background checks, type of firearms allowed, for example, regulation of fully automatic arms or magazine capacity limits, safe storage laws, and so forth. On one side, gun rights advocates argue that law-abiding citizens have the right, even a constitutional right like the Second Amendment in the United States, to own firearms for protection, hunting, sport, and education and enforcement against criminal is the key. On the other hand, gun control advocates seek measures to reduce the likelihood of accidents or weapons falling into the wrong hands, citing instances of gun violence and comparing regulatory models from different regions. This is a very complex and often emotionally charged topic. In this podcast, our focus was on technology and history, and I won't delve deep into the policy. It's worth saying, however, that firearm safety is paramount no matter where you stand on issues. Treating your firearm as it's always loaded, securing guns from unauthorized access, especially children, and getting proper training and universal recommendations for everyone, pro-gun and anti-gun, should all agree upon. Responsible ownership is the key to minimizing tragic accidents. To summarize this divisive topic, firearms have a dual nature in society. They can provide food security and sport, but in the wrong hands or circumstances they can cause harm. This duality has been recognized for as long as guns existed. There's a famous old saying, God created man, but Sam Cole made them equal, highlighting how a firearm could level the playing field in self-defense. Conversely, there is a phrase, live by the sword, die by the sword, updated by some to God instead of a sword, warning of the dangers of a life intertwined with weapons. My take, as a host who enjoys shooting sports, is the understanding of firearms, how they work, their capabilities, and their limits actually promote safety and an informed discussion. Fear often comes from the unknown, and firearms technology, once demystified, becomes less of an object of mystique and more of a tool one can choose to own or not own, and to regulate rationally. And now it's time for a long-winded, giving you a fair warning, conclusion to the episode. As we come to the end of this long journey into technology of firearms, I find myself circling back to where we started. My first day at the range, smell of burnt powder in the air, and hot spent casing tinkling on the floor. At the time, I was focused on aligning the sights and controlling my breath and steadying my grip. But now I appreciate that every shot I took was the product of centuries of innovation and history coming together. The Glock 19 in my hand wasn't just a modern sidearm. It was the descendant of the Chinese fire lance, the matchlock, the flintlock, the Colt revolver, the Browning pistol, all the lineage rolled into one compact, reliable tool. The engineering that lets me fire 15 rounds as fast as I can pull a trigger within less than a minute, with each case ejecting smoothly, is remarkable when you think about it. And the science that sends each bullet into the target, the precise grooves in the barrel, impacting spin, the balance of the bullet weight and velocity, the trajectory account for gravity, It's the physics that are made practical. Learning the physics and mechanics made me a more responsible gun owner and shooter. Studying history gave me a deeper appreciation for the freedom and power of a firearm. Understanding the firearms deeply, not only how they impact the society, but how and why they exist, made me a more thoughtful shooter. It bridges the gap between merely shooting and truly appreciating what's happening with each trigger pull. It's similar to how a car enthusiast isn't just content to get from here to there. They want to look under the hood. In the same way, knowing that my shotgun uses a smooth bore for spread or my rifle scope needs adjustment for bullet drop at 200 yards, both enrich a human experience. It turns shooting from just a physical act into a mindful one. I also find that history provides a big perspective. Firearms have influenced the course of nations and wars and the lives of individuals. By studying the development of guns, I ended up studying human history as well. Its laws, its wars, the industry development, and societal changes. All of it is sort of intertwined into one deep story. The fact that I can casually go target shooting on a weekend owes to technological developments that were once cutting-edge military secrets or industrial feats. Think of an assembly line production for rifles or the chemistry behind smokeless powder. They were big, actually, you could say huge deals at the time. Bringing back to society today, I would encourage everyone, whether you're gun owner or not, to approach the topic of firearms with an informed mind. Revisit the fundamentals we discussed. A gun at the end is a machine designed to launch a projectile via controlled explosion. They can be used for good or evil, like many other tools. By stripping away the mystery, we can talk about firearms in a more rational, less polarized way. For gun owners, that means respecting the power that you can handle through training and strict safety habits. For those less familiar or on the fence, it just might mean recognizing the genuine use and cultural values attached to guns for many people, even as we strive to minimize abuse and misuse. In doing this episode, I was struck by how personal stories and technical details complement each other. The personal anecdote of me nervously squeezing my first shot connect to an educational narrative of how trigger releases a hammer or a striker, igniting the powder to send a 9mm bullet downrange at tremendous speed. The story of soldiers struggling with reloaded muskets under fire ties into explanation how bolt-action rifle or semi-auto made that easier. It's all part of grand tapestry of humans. So next time I'm at the range, I'll smile a bit, thinking of the flash in the pan that didn't happen thanks to modern primers, or the rifling that keeps me shooting at targets, or even the polymer frame that makes my pistol so light. And I'll definitely remember that behind each of these features was an inventor, a person, or a number of people in history, figuring out, sometimes with brilliant insight, sometimes through painful trial and error, how to achieve a certain goal. Thank you for joining me in this exploration of firearms science, technology, and history. I hope you found it engaging and maybe even a little enlightening, as I did working on this podcast. Whether you're a firearm enthusiast or just someone who is curious, you now hopefully have a deeper understanding of what goes on when a bang happened and what it took to get from the evil hand cannons to the firearms of today. Stay safe, stay curious, and until the next time, this is Sergey signing out.